Who doesn't love a classic station wagon these days? After years and years of just being discarded and often used in demolition derbies, today classic wagons are worth quite a princely sum, mainly because there are hardly any around. And today what we're going to discuss are the wagons that were the most powerful in the classic car era. By the way, that would not include this 1974 Colony Park that you see here, which had a measly 195 horsepower from its optional 460 cubic inch V8. Really what you're going to see here are wagons that are made from 1970 and before, and that's because beginning in 1971 for General Motors, 1972 for some Chrysler and Ford variants, or even 1971 as well, a lot of the engines in wagons, as well as other vehicles that were produced by the Big Three and even AMC, really started having lower compression ratios and consequently lower horsepower. And yes, somebody's going to point out that they switched from SAE gross to net in 1972, which made the horsepower ratings look significantly lower. But the horsepower ratings were really lower because the engines were detuned to really help with emissions. So you're really not going to see too many wagons after that point on this list, although I did squeak one in there that I think is now a classic, kind of a cult classic, and it has a pretty awesome engine. Of course, in modern day, there have been some very powerful wagons. Perhaps my favorite is the CTS V-Wagon with the 6-speed manual transmission. That, to me, is kind of the pinnacle wagon, at least from a domestic producer. But alas, let's get started with the top classic wagons and begin with number 5. And that is the 1994 to 1996 Roadmaster Estate Wagon. Now, Buick decided to resurrect the Roadmaster nameplate after having sunsetted in 1958. And it was reintroduced in 1991, would continue on through 1996. And in the inaugural year, 1991, there was a Roadmaster Estate Wagon. So why am I not including that on this list? Well, for 1991 and 1991 only, the Roadmaster Estate Wagon would come standard with a 5-liter Chevrolet-powered V8 engine that made 170 horsepower. The following year, 1992, it would get a 5.7-liter, 180 horsepower Chevrolet V8. But really, the true power came when, in 1994, the Roadmaster got the LT1 engine that was really derived from the engine that was in the Corvette. It did have some differences. It had a 2-bolt main bottom end. It did have a cast iron block and heads as opposed to aluminum heads that were on the Corvette. And regardless, it was still extremely powerful, making 260 net horsepower. Now, to put that into perspective, if I wanted to say what that means in terms of gross horsepower and how the wagons were rated back in the day, it's probably about 365 gross horsepower. So it really was quite a bit. And I have to say that if you've driven one of these wagons with the LT1 engine, they are extremely fast. Well, at least for a wagon. 0 to 60 took about 7.5 seconds, I would say, for these wagons. If you got the sedan, it was even quicker. And the LT1 just propels these vehicles effortlessly. It's a smooth engine, got good fuel economy on the freeway. You could get 24, 25, 26 miles per gallon on the freeway. And when you put the hammer down, the thing really, really moved. These are starting to become a little bit of a classic, and their values are appreciating as a consequence. I think also because the powertrains are very reliable in general. The LT1 engine is a great engine. It does have one Achilles heel, and that's the OptiSpark setup, which is the distributor that's behind the water pump. And, well, when you put electronics near coolant, sometimes bad things, let's just say, happen. And regardless, those OptiSpark units tend to go bad. You have to remove the water pump to replace them. It's not a huge deal, especially in terms of what you have to do today on cars to service them. But it is an additional step and something that you just have to bear in mind on these LT1 V8s, that you really should probably replace that OptiSpark unit if you're going to make this a daily driver. But aside from that, the Roadmaster wagon, I think, it's kind of got a good look to it. A little bubbly, a little doughy, but not a bad look overall. I think the real letdown on the Roadmaster wagon and the Roadmaster sedan as well was really the interior, which, especially once it was redone after a few model years, just became a plastic fantastic interior by Hasbro or Play School. It really was abysmal. The worst of GM in terms of really not much of a design theme on this redone interior. By contrast, the original Roadmaster interiors had at least some nice fake wood grain and more gauges. For whatever reason, they simplified that, took out the wood grain, and just made it kind of this uniform blah plastic. And that's really the unfortunate part, because if you want the LT1 engine, you have to get the updated interior. Oh well, nothing's perfect, but you do still get a great wagon, full frame, rear-wheel drive, old school. And like I said, I think these are starting to really appreciate in value, particularly the ones with the LT1s. I don't think many people really care for the 1991 with the 5-liter V8. But they're still cool nonetheless, and that's why they make it to number 5. Let's move on to number 4. And at number 4, I picked, I think, my favorite from the Ford stable. That is the 1969 Ford Country Squire. Now, for 1969, the Ford Country Squire styling as well as the LTD was all new. 1969 would actually mark a new model generation for Ford in terms of its full-size cars, and that would last all the way through 1978, at least the underpinnings would. Now, for 1969, there was also a new engine under hood. There was the 429 cubic inch V8 engine. So this was the so-called 385 series V8, and it really was a great engine. Of course, you might know the 429, you might know the 460. Those are really the common variants of this particular engine series. And with the introduction of the 429 came an optional 4 Venturi, or 4-barrel, 429 cubic inch V8 that you could stuff under hood that would make 360 gross horsepower. Now, this was more than the prior wagons that came with the FE sourced or the FE engine, the 428 cubic inch V8 that was making about 340 horsepower. So they did have a little bit more power, and they were extremely smooth. Now, I will say, unfortunately, they were topped by that lovely Autolite 4300 carburetor, which had a tendency to bog, and the accelerator pump action on those just isn't very positive. But overall, it still was a pretty powerful wagon, and one that is just a pleasure to drive. If you've never driven a Ford of this era, they have a sublime ride. They are well built. They are very quiet. And, you know, I have to say that these, I think, also have a pretty badass look. The LTD-related vehicles would have hidden headlamps again in 1969 after seeing their introduction in the 1968 cars. The Country Squire, as a consequence, has these beautiful hidden headlamps and front end. It's starting with the little bunky beak that would become more pronounced with the 1971 model year, when Bunky Knudsen would really try to make Fords look like Pontiacs. But I think this 1969 model is one of the most handsome of all, and it has a great interior still. You've got this wraparound dash, nice materials, relatively speaking. So an overall great wagon, powerful, and that's why it's made it to number 4 on the list. Let's move on to number 3. And at number 3, we're going to have the start of a trio of General Motors wagons. So Mopar fans, I'm sorry, but we have the 1970 Buick Electra Estate Wagon. Now, 1970 is really a landmark year in terms of General Motors from a design standpoint, from an engine standpoint, and that's because 1970 would mark the year in which a lot of divisions would have one-year-only high-compression V8s. For example, Buick introduced its 455 cubic inch V8 for 1970 and 1969. Really, from 1967, when the engine was introduced, to 1969, the 430 cubic inch V8 was Buick's top engine. It was enlarged to 455 cubic inches for 1970, and 1970 would be the only year in which it was a high compression V8. Before, in 1971, the compression ratio would be lowered significantly so that the engine could run on unleaded fuel. As a consequence, the clamshell wagons that preceded this particular variant of full-size wagons never had the power that these did. And 1970 is just a great year for General Motors as a consequence because of the engines. Not only did Buick have its one-year 455 that was a premium fuel engine, Cadillac had a one-year only premium fuel 500 cubic inch V8 in the Eldorado. Pontiac would introduce its 455 cubic inch for 1970 as well. So that would be the only year for a high compression 455 engine from Pontiac. And Chevrolet would have its 454 cubic inch engine introduced in 1970. So that was the only year for the high compression 454. Interestingly, Oldsmobile introduced a 455 back in 1968. So it had a high compression 455 for a number of years. Regardless, I digress. Take a look at this beautiful 1970 Buick Electra estate wagon with a vinyl roof, no less. A wagon with a vinyl roof. That's kind of the answer to the question that nobody asked, but I'm sure the dealers sold them because they made significant incremental margin. In any case, the 1970 Buick, I think, is a handsome wagon. You've got this beautiful front end with the midsection that has the plastic emblem, one of the rarest pieces. If you have one, they're worth about maybe $300 to $500 in really nice shape, because those center emblems would always crack. As I mentioned, they're made of plastic. That portion of the nose protrudes the most on these Buicks, and as a consequence, often people just drove into a barrier and then they cracked and were never replaced. So you see a lot of Buicks without them. But the engine under hood for 1970, as I was mentioning, was the one-year-only high-compression 455 cubic inch V8 that made 370 gross horsepower in the Electra estate wagon and in the Electra. And I have to say, one of the great things about the Buick V8s is just the overall smoothness of operation. Like many other General Motors V8s at the time frame, they don't have too many Achilles heels, I would say, as is typical for a lot of GM engines, except the Cadillac V8s. A lot of them tend to have water pumps that fail, and the Buick is not an exception. The water pump job on the Buick, I would say, is harder because it's got these little bolts that are tough to get out, and they often snap as opposed to more robust bolts. It's unfortunate. And also, they sometimes had oil pump issues, but if you change the oil regularly as you were supposed to, they ran for a long, long time. Buick big block engines were great engines, reliable, robust, smooth, and powerful. And the engines in the Electra estate wagon were no different. And of course, you got the turbohydromatic 400 transmission. Really was no better transmission than that at the time. In fact, it was sold to many other foreign automakers, including Rolls-Royce and Jaguar, as well as Ferrari. So a lot of companies use General Motors components outside of General Motors. I don't think Ford, as an example, ever had any buyers for its C6 outside of Ford proper and, some, let's say, motorhome conversion companies and things like that. But the GM transmissions were just fantastic. So you got this beautiful 370 horsepower 455 under hood, and you had a very comfortable wagon inside. The interior and the materials were pretty good still by this point. Although I will say General Motors started cheaping out on its interiors in the latter portion of the 1960s. They just weren't as nice as the mid-1960s. And I will say still a pretty nice theme. A big IP, big speedometer. Everything's kind of got these picture frames around it. I happen to like it. I think it's a overall great-looking wagon and, great and handsome interior. So that's why it makes it on this list. Let's move on now to number 2, and that is the 1970 Bonneville Safari wagon. Now, before somebody starts poking me and saying the optional engine in the Bonneville Safari made 370 horsepower, that was the 455 cubic inch high output V8. There was a 360 horsepower 455 that you could get that was topped by a 4-barrel carburetor. And then the standard engine was a 400 cubic inch V8. So you had to option up a little bit in the Pontiac, but the 455 HO, I think, was pretty conservatively rated at 370 horsepower. I will say that I've driven the Buicks with the 455 that made 370 horsepower, and right from a get-go, they don't feel all that fast, although they really seem to feel quick in the, I would say, 40 mile per hour to 80, 85 mile per hour range, and that's because they have such tall rear ends in the Buicks, taller than the Pontiacs. The Buick Electra came, as an example, with a standard 256 rear end. I think the estate wagon came with a 283 or thereabouts. It was numerically low rear end, whereas the Pontiacs with the 455 HO had a significantly higher numerically ratio, a shorter rear end. So you really get off the line with much more kind of neck snapping acceleration than you do in the Buick. I will say that the Bonneville Safari and the Pontiac V8s in general, they just seem to have a bit more zip than the other divisions. And that dates all the way back to even, frankly, the standard 389 cubic inch two-barrel V8s that Pontiac was producing in the mid-1960s that were standard, as an example, in the Catalinas. If you've driven one of those, it's just the perfect engine. As a two-barrel, it doesn't feel like a two-barrel. It doesn't wheeze. It's peppy. It's fast. It's smooth. It's quiet. I think Pontiac V8s have to be, well, I won't reveal my favorite General Motors big block V8, but Pontiacs are up there. I really got to think about that, by the way. In any case, the 455 HO in a wagon is just an awesome combination. I don't know how many were produced. It had to have been very, very rare because, as I said, you had to option up twice to get that from the 400 to the 455, from the 455 to the 455 HO. But wow, if you got it, you really had a screamer on your hands of a wagon. Now, unfortunately, the looks of the 1970 Pontiac aren't necessarily my favorite. That front end, I don't know what the designers were thinking. They got into this significant beak and were trying to do different things with it, and kind of got away from the arrowhead theme for a number of years to something that was, well, let's just say not as elegant. And the interiors by this point had also, as I mentioned, started seeing some cost cutting. So the interiors of the 1970 Pontiacs aren't quite as great as the mid-60s Pontiacs. No real wood here, unfortunately, and no real wood on any Pontiac in 1970. It was all fake wood if you saw any wood on these cars. And it's just a shame. But at least they went out with a bang in 1970 in the final model year for the wagon with that wonderful 455 HO. And even if you didn't get the 455 HO, you got the 360 horsepower 455, you still had a peppy wagon. There were just some differences in terms of the camshaft. The compression ratio, as opposed to being 10 to 1, was 10.25 to 1. So you got a little bit more compression ratio, a little bit more power, a little bit more camshaft duration. But still a very smooth and just great running engine in your 1970 Bonneville Safari. Let's move on to number one. And at number one, we interestingly have the wagon from the cheapest General Motors division, the Chevrolet Kingswood Estate, with the 454 cubic inch V8 that made 390 horsepower. Now, in terms of gross horsepower ratings on classic wagons, this is really the pinnacle. I can't think of another wagon that topped the 390 horsepower mark. And you could veritably say that prior years, like in 1969, for example, Chevrolet had a 427 cubic inch big block underhood. It was premium fuel, it made 390 horsepower. But I picked the 1970 because it's got more torque and it's the only year of the high compression 454 cubic inch V8 from Chevrolet. And there were multiple 454s. The 390 was the top engine in any of the full-size Chevrolets. So you actually got the most powerful engine in the cheapest wagon. Although, while this was rated at 390 horsepower and the Pontiac HO engine was 370, I have a feeling that the true horsepower ratings were closer. Maybe even the Pontiac had a little bit more spunk. Pontiac was known for underrating their engines during this time frame. Remember, this was during a time frame when insurance companies were really starting to bill customers higher rates for sportier vehicles or vehicles with more powerful engines. That really wasn't the case prior to the mid-1960s. Everybody kind of paid similar insurance rates, despite the fact that you drove a car that had far more power maybe than your neighbors. But by this point, insurance companies were wisening up to that, and they were charging different rates. And so some companies and divisions underrated their engines. Regardless, the 1970 Kingswood Estate has that great 454 underhood, just a great looking wagon. Again, I think, while the clamshells might be some of my favorites, at least the early model year clamshells before the big bumpers came into play, well, these 1970 variants are also very handsome. And, on the inside of your Kingswood Estate, you got a decent interior. Wasn't all that great, but I think the 1970 interior was still a step up from the 1971s when Chevrolet went to that the new version of the full-size wagon in 1971, and the interiors were redone in all the General Motors full-size cars. I think they cheaped out kind of once again, just went even cheaper. So the 1970 models have kind of the last of some decent interiors, although they're not as nice as the prior model years in the mid-1960s model years. So that's my list of top and most powerful classic wagons. And I'm sure the Mopar fans out there are kind of belly aching. Well, why no Mopars? Well, unfortunately, at least to my knowledge, if you take a wagon like the Chrysler Town & Country, yes, Chrysler had the 440 cubic inch V8. You could get a high compression variant. But it really made, I don't think, any more than 350 gross horsepower in the Chryslers. And you couldn't get the optional TNT V8 in the Chrysler wagons, unfortunately. You could get it in the sedans and the coupes, but for whatever reason, Chrysler didn't allow it in the wagons. And that's just a shame because, well, who wouldn't want a TNT-powered Mopar wagon? That isn't to say that the Mopar wagons aren't cool. They are awesome. I mean, what other wagon are you going to get the torsion bar front suspension? It's certainly something that helped with the handling, and they're a pretty stiff ride. It also helped with that torsion bar front, the leaf spring rear. You could really tow with your Mopar wagons. You really, really could. They towed very well, despite the fact that they were unibody. So I do have some love for the Mopar wagons. I do think that they are excellent, but to my knowledge, they didn't have as high of horsepower as the wagons that I mentioned, so they didn't make the list. I should also say that for some of these wagons, the engines that I mentioned were available in multiple years. For example, the 1969 Country Squire, the 429 was available in 1970 as well. The 70 Electra, that premium fuel 455, as I mentioned, was 1 year only. Same with the Bonneville Safari, and same with the Kingswood. So it just depends, but I picked these particular models because I thought they looked handsome. Thanks again for watching. Put a comment in the comment section.